All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you could just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We will get it signed, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. So this evening, Books and Books, once again in collaboration with the University of Miami Center for the Humanities, is very happy to present Dr. Guido Ruggiero and his new book, The Renaissance in Italy, A Social and Cultural History of the Rinascimento. And here to take over hosting duties for us this evening, please welcome to the microphone the director of the UM Center for the Humanities, Professor Miyoko Suzuki.
Thank you so much. So we have a full house here in Books and Books tonight, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first event of the semester, Guido Ruggiero's book talk. And we have 3 more book talks at the beginning of each month in February, March, and April. Wilson Sheeran in February on politics and language and Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. Amanda Sondi on the crisis of Islamic masculinities in March, and Hugh Thomas, another historian, on the secular clergy in England in the Middle Ages. So those are events for this semester. I just want to tell you that we also have Rita Dove coming to the university on February 5th at 7 p.m. in Storer Auditorium, and she'll be talking about her Sonata Mulatica. So everyone here and live stream are welcome to those events. So tonight, without further ado, I'd like to ask Mary Lindemann, the chair of the history department and a fellow early modernist, to come to the podium to introduce Guido Ruggiero.
Good evening. Oh well, that's promising. Okay. Here in my hands I have a book, and it's a big, fat, sassy book at that. I've picked it up unsuspectingly, and now I have to make up my mind. Should I read it? And how should I make up my mind whether to waste my time with this one or something else? Well, you look at the front of it. It's a very pretty cover. You can see it there. It's a nice cover, and it's got a slightly sexy print on the front, and these are promising attributes, but I'm still not yet convinced. Still, the author appears to be an Italian, and I suppose that's a plus when you're writing about the Renaissance. The inside flap looks enticing, promising a vibrant and relevant critical study of a period too long burdened by anachronistic and outdated ways of thinking about the past. But maybe I should look at the back of the book and see what the experts in the field think. So I flip it over, and I'm struck by several adjectives: imaginative, compelling, fascinating, and bold. Sounds good. So as an unsuspecting, innocent reader browsing the shelves on the newest offerings on the shelves, I'm probably going to give it a try. But what about me, who knows Guido Ruggiero longer than anyone in this room, and who is also his colleague? Do I find these adjectives just a bit of publishing hype? Hardly. Guido Ruggiero's The Renaissance in Italy is all the things promised by its blurbologists. It is imaginative, compelling, fascinating, and bold. But none of that really surprises me, as those adjectives, too, singly and in combination, pertain to his earlier works. His first book, Violence in Renaissance Venice, to which I contributed in a very minor role of filling in punch card little things like this, surely deserves the adjective imaginative. Guido was one of the first historians to apply quantitative methods to sources long thought to be unquantifiable, criminal records of the late medieval and Renaissance period. In his Boundaries of Eros, which was published in 1985 and will be 30 years old this year, Boundaries of Eros, Sex, Crime, and Sexuality in Renaissance Venice, he provided a compelling look at sexual behavior that, since then, no social or cultural study of sex and sexuality has been able to ignore. Several years later, Binding Passions, Tales of Magic and Power from the End of the Renaissance offered fascinating glimpses into the world of illicit on the basis of Inquisition records. Finally, and most recently, Machiavellian Love gave a bold reassessment of sex, self, and society in the Renaissance, while showing the extent to which the literature of high culture was deeply rooted in everyday experiences and how deeply influential sex was to the construction of Renaissance identities. Sex is a bit of a theme here. So there is really nothing new about Guido's ability to stretch our imaginations, compel our interest, fascinate our minds, and boldly go where few historians before him have ventured. Thus, tonight, we can expect once more to be beguiled and enlightened by Guido Ruggiero in presenting his exciting new interpretation of the Renaissance in Italy. Please join me in welcoming Guido Ruggiero.
Well, it's hard to follow that introduction, and I'd like to thank Mary. All week she's been threatening about what she would say about me, because she really has known me longer than anybody else here. In fact, rather strangely, now that she's the chair of my chair of the department, she was in the first class I taught when I started teaching way too long ago. And 90 students, she consistently broke the curve. I couldn't figure out who the woman was in the class who was so brilliant. And it was a class in my I'm going to tell this tale about Mary because she's had me worrying so much all week. It was a class in Cincinnati where all the young German girls would sit in the front row and kind of look at me. I was 27 at the time, and quite a bit more interesting than I am at the moment. And so I was always imagining who this person was, and saying, "Speak up in class, let me know who you are," and looking at these bright young faces in the first couple of rows. I won't go all the way through with this story, but finally the last day of the class, this little shy girl was in the back of all these blonde, Teutonic, beautiful women, kind of telling me how great I was. And I kept saying, "Don't let that be Mary Lindemann. Please don't let that be Mary Lindemann." And one by one, they kind of disappeared, and there was this little shy girl. It was Mary. She's really changed, folks, I'll tell you. But she's always been a great scholar and a great friend and a great person, and I'm glad she didn't tell you all that she knows about me. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this new book. I hope it's not going to be, in a short time that we have, I really can't obviously summarize 635 pages of the heavy book that she showed you. But let me begin by confessing that, like many students of the Italian Renaissance, I've long been concerned about the ongoing decline of interest in that fascinating age, although this crowd seems to suggest something else. But people have for a while, been thinking of it as too distant, too unmodern, too irrelevant to contemporary problems to be of significance. And unfortunately, many of my fellow students of the period, I fear, have responded to that decline by defining the period defensively, in narrower and narrower terms, limiting it largely to a handful of elite male intellectuals labeled humanists, a small coterie of admittedly great artists, and a series of highly technical reconstructions of local politics and social strife for each of the dozens of cities that flourished in Italy at the time. So when Cambridge asked me to write a book on the period, I naively accepted with visions of providing a revisioned Italian Renaissance that would recapture our modern or even postmodern imagination. In the end, I hope I've provided a book that, at least in rethinking the period, will help revitalize studies of the day, and at best allow its readers at the same time to creatively consider a series of new questions, and not so new ones, about the very nature of society and culture at the edge of the modern world. If so, its readers will find in it not only a suggestively different past, but also find some suggestively different ways of thinking about their present. For I believe history should not be about burying the past or finishing it off, but creating a larger, richer present, exploding easy truisms, and offering new questions. So the book that you have, although it has many pages, has fewer concrete facts than most, and many more questions, hopefully often troubling ones in the best sense of the term. At the same time, it is a storytelling book, hopefully in the mode of Renaissance culture itself, where storytelling in many ways was the medium of cultural transmission, continuity, and conflict. In part, I've tried to use a narrative form of storytelling to illustrate the way life was lived and felt at the time, and in part to make the deeper questions being asked take form and have the bite they need. In a way, then, this book is designed to take the reader on a storytelling walk through the richly flowering garden of Renaissance society and culture. A garden like that portrayed in its cover illustration by Veronese, with Mars and Venus in the forefront, violence and love, war and peace, concord and discord, but placed in a much more complex Renaissance garden, which, while beautiful, is also wild and peppered with bushes and flowers that have their thorns. And as in the case in most societies, it is a garden with a half-human, half-animal satyr lurking with a knowing smile in the background. And let's see if I can make this work. There you have our satyr in the background. But rather than trying to provide a brief overview of this large book this evening, let me suggest a few of those questions that are not without their thorns. First off, and most obviously, there is a question about what we should call the period. Actually, when one thinks about it, the name Italian Renaissance seems rather amazingly anachronistic. I wonder what denizens of the period, like Machiavelli, would have made of the fact that their day would be labeled with a term invented by a French 19th century intellectual, Jules Michelet, who coined the term Renaissance to point out the deep parallels that he saw between the classical revival of his day in France and the classical revival he saw as enlivening an earlier elite culture in Italy. I imagine that Machiavelli would have been outraged at the idea, for he, like many of his contemporaries, saw the French of his day as dangerous and relatively uncivilized barbarians whose wars and greed had wrought havoc upon and destroyed many of the glories of his Italy. Why then, I wonder, more than a century and a half after Michelet's anachronistic vision, should we stick with a French label that is misleading, based on deep misunderstandings of the period, and drawn from a language and culture which most Italians and others saw as inferior at the time? Perhaps then the inaccurate and anachronistic terminology Italian Renaissance should be replaced with something more appropriate. In the book, I opted for Rinascimento, which was pronounced very nicely by our introducer, for several reasons. First, it stresses a series of re-words popular across the social spectrum that evoke the contemporary ideal of return to earlier, more perfect, and more important ages. I'll give you the re-words. First, it stresses such ideals were a critical part of the culture and values of the day. Ancient Rome and the first church of Christianity being only the most important. The ideals of reform, renewal, return, and rebirth were ubiquitous in a society that deeply feared the new and much preferred returning to an earlier, more perfect day to understand what truly mattered and to defend the changes that they were making in society. Unfortunately, however, Rinascita, or rebirth, was actually the least used of these words, and thus admittedly is somewhat less than perfect as a base of the name for the period, as a Rinascimento. But it does nicely evoke the general thrust of positive return to superior early times that stands behind all these rewords. I did briefly consider labeling the period the Age of Reform, or the Reformation. But that had one obvious problem. We already have a Reformation, and I'm quite confident that Reformation scholars like my outstanding colleague Carl Gunther would not be happy to share the label of his field with a period of Italian history that started earlier, about 1250 in my rethinking of the period, and then overlapped his for a while in the 16th century, with what appears to be very different religious, social, and cultural developments, although those differences may not be, in fact, as real as they seem. Having said that, however, the question does remain whether Reformation scholars should be allowed to monopolize the label, or whether we might consider that the true Reformation, the big Reformation, really did begin in mid-13th century Italy, as a general movement of social, religious, and cultural reform that reached its fruition in Europe in the 16th century, as that larger area struggled to reincorporate the developments of 14th and 15th century Italy into a rapidly changing society, with the concomitant wide-ranging upheavals that we associate with what is currently labeled the Reformation. But obviously that thorny question is probably too thorny for this volume that focuses on Italy 1250 to 1575 and its broader world impact. Thus my label for the period, Rinascimento. But I will leave it up to the many young Turks that I see in the audience to ask this deeper question in the future, and perhaps steal the Reformation for Italy, or at least its deep underpinnings and origins. A second question worthy of the satyr lurking in the garden emerges in the book towards the end of chapter 2. There, after spending considerable time attempting to present a general overview of the way urban governments developed and functioned in the dozens of Italian cities of the day, trying to reduce the myriad councils, magistracies, bureaucracies, and ad hoc committees that seemed to multiply over the period to some kind of a conceptual model, I test the commitment of readers by suggesting that perhaps all that discussion was unnecessary. Essentially, I ask the dangerous, does the emperor have no clothes question? For I wonder if perhaps we have overestimated the importance of government in the period, misled by our own modern fascination with it to give it more credit in the pre-modern world than it merits. Such radical thoughts in the book unleash dangerous reveries about a Rinascimento where government was just one competing organization of power, along with numerous others, often informal and relatively invisible, that were much more significant. Could it be that we've been led astray by the very richness of the archival records that have fueled our research on the period and offered such a rich range of sources for understanding it? Without a doubt, a kind of governmental explosion of documentation in the Rinascimento has allowed us to know much more about the period, and in the process, much more about the institutions that created those documents. But perhaps we should be suspicious of that very richness. Evidently, governments were not likely to create records that stressed their own lack of significance or power. And of course, in many ways, they were powerful, especially when it came to financing war, providing justice, or attempting to pool resources. And the flourishing of magistracies and councils in the period clearly reflects a faith that government could accomplish a great deal. But along with that faith, and just below the surface of the records created, there runs an unnerving trail of testimony and complaints that documents the way institutions did not work and were often little more than pious reiterations of generally shared ideals. Shared ideals that were enforced in more customary and less visible ways that have not been given their due. Tellingly, over and over again, matters come to the attention of government when other informal means of control or other powerful bodies fail to perform as expected, almost as if government was the least likely last resort when all other solutions failed. And reflecting on the situation, I wonder if it could have been otherwise. Rinascimento governments attempted to control densely populated urban areas and their surrounding countrysides without many of the basic tools that make governance possible. No computers, no typewriters, even very limited forms of alphabetization and filing, not to mention just the crudest statistics and networks of communication. Over and over again, one encounters the basic inability of governments to even keep track of what they are trying to do. In a way, then, I wonder if we should see government, in fact, as just another rather limited institutional organization of power in a much more complex competition, and perhaps more radically yet, if we should rethink what modern government actually does. To what degree is government just the theater of power, or even its bread and circuses, while the real battles are fought and won elsewhere, too often unnoticed? But perhaps the biggest and most thorny question for understanding the period is how should a history of its famous culture be conceptualized without using humanism as the focus? For as Paul Oscar Christeller, the great student of Renaissance humanists, pointed out long ago, humanism simply did not exist in the period. It was actually an educational ideal of 19th century Europe. The 19th century German educators who coined the term used it to defend their own educational ideals that stressed the importance of classical literature and an appreciation of ancient culture for the formation of an educated bourgeois elite capable of leading German society and perhaps protecting it from the dangerous, unregulated passions of their lower classes. Certainly that educational ideal had precedence in the Rinascimento, as it did in the Middle Ages and ancient world, for that matter. But from there, it is a long jump to find their 19th century educational program as an intellectual movement in 15th century Italy, or more daring yet, to see it as a cultural theme of an entire earlier period, as lately many scholars have begun to insist. Although the term humanism never existed, I have to admit, in the Rinascimento, the label humanist did begin to be used towards the end of the 15th century. Ironically, it appears that at first it was used as a slightly derogatory term applied by students to university professors who seemed too focused on classical studies and thus were hopefully out of it, a slight whose lack of justice many of us can sympathize with today. And this theme was explored with biting satire in comedies of the 16th century, with the stock character of the pedant humanist, mouthing misquoted Latin, advising ancient inanities, and ogling young boys with sodomitical intent, providing the source of much laughter. Nonetheless, the label began to be used to identify an intellectual elite in the 16th century, when in Italy, elites in every sector of life were being more strictly defined and defended. True aristocrats over the merely rich, true artists over the merely skillful artisan, true courtesans over the merely common prostitute, and true humanists over the merely learned, all emerged in Italy as Italy became ever more courtly and aristocratic. But even this new intellectual elite never defined their intellectual activities as humanism. And while most humanists tended to stress the importance of their study of the classical world and its languages, this by no means defined them, and one would be hard-pressed to formulate a program of scholarship that separated them from the broader cultural world of their day. In fact, in the end, I fear that what primarily separated them from the broader cultural world and its reverence for the ancient was more a status claim than an intellectual program. Their claim to be an intellectual, or to be the intellectual elite. Not even a superior mastery of classical languages, however, separated them from a significant number of humbler intellectuals, especially notaries, lawyers, university professors, and churchmen who sported similar or superior learning in that area, but lacked the social status to support such claims. Significantly, the attempt to discover humanism in a day and among intellectuals who did not think in 19th century terms of an intellectual program to define and in a way ennoble a German bourgeois elite, has seriously distorted the way we look at the culture of the period. With present-day definitions of humanism that vary widely, different works and scholars are included in what is assumed to have been the primary cultural movement of the day, while a wide range of works are consigned to a periphery or an intellectual purgatory, labeled medieval or non-humanist, that is virtually totally imaginary and anachronistic. The result is an almost endless list of questions and scholarly debates that are badly posed and that often lead nowhere, or worse yet, lead astray. Yet in the end, all these problems and false paths fall away if we simply eliminate humanism as the cultural agenda of the period. But of course, eliminating one problem always entails creating others. And the issue becomes, if we stop looking for humanism as a measure of the culture of the day, how do we think about that culture? In the book, I opted for a quasi-anthropological view of culture, suggesting that we think in terms of a shared primary culture that developed and changed over the period. A distinctive, evolving culture that most people shared at one level or another, who lived in the lively urban centers of the Rinascimento. This shared culture was what allowed individuals to communicate and understand their life and their peers to the extent that that was possible. I thought of this shared culture more as a discussion about the way things work and the way life is led, where a wide segment of the population participated, but did not necessarily agree or understand in the same way each element of that discussion. But I hypothesized that their disagreements and misunderstandings fell within a limited range. No one used encounters with Martians to explain their behavior or that of their neighbors, just as my students seldom claim that such encounters made them miss the midterm or the final. And just as my students' excuses for missing exams are relatively finite within a culture that we all share, so too the range of understandings and meanings within a shared primary culture in a complex world like that of the Rinascimento can be charted, not as a structure, but as a rather fluid but limited discussion or discourse. In the book, I formulate a series of interrelated hypotheses about what the shared primary culture of the period looked like. First, I began with a basic concept like time, which is a theme throughout the book and which seems to me so crucial for understanding the period. All the rewords that typified not just the scholarly world of the time, but the general way of thinking about change and time itself seemed a basic shared way of seeing the world. Reform, renewal, rebirth, all stress a vision of positive change as not moving ahead in a linear vision of time, but returning to an earlier, perfect day in a circular vision. The ideal of returning to the first times of the Roman world, or the first times of Christianity, or even the first times of the Middle Ages, were widely shared and acted upon, even as they might be deployed and used in quite different ways at different social or intellectual levels. From this perspective, an imagined humanism dissolves into a much broader and richer cultural world, where the circular gearing of clocks, the return of the seasons, and the revolution of the heavens, the concept of political reform to defend political change, and the ritual heart of the Mass with the recreation of the blood and flesh of Christ all make sense and are deeply interrelated. Along with time, concepts of space seem to be another crucial aspect of the shared culture of the day. Significantly, although it was not entirely true, the Rinascimento thought of itself as urban-centered, and its special society that made Italy unique was imagined as essentially urban. Certainly for most of the period, Italy was by far the most urban area of Europe, and its political and cultural scene were dominated by an urban vision. The intimate cityscapes dominated by neighborhood and family were crucial for the way people thought about their identities and their lives. But the space of Italy was also tellingly a space that was seen and understood as literally built upon the ancient Roman world. And its remains were constant reminders of that world. This was a civilization that lived in the ruins of an earlier great civilization. And the superiority of that world and Italy's potential for world dominance, if not politically, at least economically and culturally, were always there as you walk through the streets of your city. At the same time, urban space and space in general in the Rinascimento were much different from the three-dimensional space in which we live. If anything, the most significant space of the time was one we hardly recognize today. For its urban landscape and architecture were dominated by a deeply meaningful spiritual space at every level, from its streets and squares named for saints and local holy figures, to the holy relics that were the literal spiritual foundations of every church and parish that in turn marked out the neighborhoods of cities. In this much more complex space, culture operated in often novel and more intricate ways that have been too easily overlooked or simply forgotten. Language, of course, is a crucial constituent of culture, and thus I also tried to essay culture by examining what might be labeled strong words, words of exceptional power that were especially important in the discourses that organized, disciplined, and made sense of life. Obviously, a series of rewords such as reform, renewal, and rebirth were especially important. But I also singled out three other terms that seem particularly important for the day: love, honor, and virtue. Love, often dismissed by serious scholars, and especially those interested in the apparently more pragmatic world of politics, was central. It was literally the tie that bound society together, and often unbound it as well, whether in the form of love between lovers, family members, friends, political allies, or between a person and the divine. And not to be overlooked, the dangerously hot passion of love that lurked behind the knowing smile of the satyr in the Renaissance garden, a passion that underlay the world and culture of the illicit and its desires that seemed to threaten the very social fabric of society. Or again, the love reversed is hate that often exploded in vendetta and the quick violence of daily life. Ubiquitous love also drove a wide range of cultural production, from love poetry to civic and religious lauds that often do not fit well in the Procrustean mold of humanism or proto-humanism. And once again, all this is evoked in the cover illustration where we see, hopefully you see there, you see playful cupids binding Venus and Mars together in love, discord and accord, peace and violence. Both honor and virtue were deeply intertwined with love and were ubiquitous as well, conceptualizing and organizing life. And once again, literature was rich with these terms and alive with the implications of the way they formed and disciplined life at every level. Thus, in the book, I examined closely how these terms were deployed in literature and archival documents in an attempt to explore the way they created the cultural dialogue that dominated the shared culture of the day, and at the same time the limits of that dominance. In sum, these themes and several others were my start on essaying the culture of the day, a glorious, rich, dangerous cultural mix, vibrant with possibilities and contemporary relevance that in 600 plus pages I have merely begun to explore. But I hope that my suggestions for rethinking the rich garden of the Rinascimento from the perspective of a shared primary culture will offer fertile ground for rethinking the period and its importance. Certainly in its feisty or sassy mix of urban, social, and cultural values, the period offers an opportunity to step outside the box of what we call, with perhaps unwise pride, the modern or postmodern world, and explore other realities and possibilities and a whole host of new questions. And hopefully in the process, the Rinascimento will be reborn in the contemporary imagination with all its glory and fascination, as well as its thorns, with the help of this wryly smiling satyr. Thank you. Sure. I may not answer them, but I'll take them.
In the back.
You mentioned the Roman Empire and the Greeks and how the folks in the Rinascimento look back on them. Was there some consensus in that culture as to how to view the ancient Roman world? Were the folks in the Rinascimento seeing themselves living in some kind of dystopian future when looking back at Rome, that they had lost a great deal and now they were just living in the shards, the ruins? And if so, were they then trying to recapture that lost glory? Or did they see it differently? I'm really fascinated as to how they, given so much dystopian literature that we have today as to some future that's going to look really terrible, whether it's global warming or nuclear war or whatever, how did they see themselves living at a time when they were living among these great shards of ancient empire?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's about 300 pages of the book.
Can you summarize
But
that
like,
in 25 words or
one of the reasons I like the idea of thinking of these things in terms of a discussion or a discourse is obviously you had the most negative vision possible, that we're living, in the ruins of a civilization that we can never hope to recapture, which then swings across a broad panorama to the other side, where very few people are saying, actually, we've done so well that we're actually beginning to step beyond the ancients. But most people fall between that, and it depends on the kind of situation that they're talking about. For example, if you're talking about government, and the government, in the 14th century, governments are articulating very rapidly. They're trying to get control of a very violent urban landscape. They have a big council, which is often called something of the popolo. Supposedly represents all the people, the popolo. But that council has become so big that it's not very effective. Okay. So they need to do something new. They need to have a smaller council that's faster and more effective and more able to deal with their problems. Okay. Today, we say, oh, I've got a new idea. Clinton. Obama would say, I've got a new idea. We're going to do this in my speech, the speech yesterday. In the Renaissance, in the 14th century, in the early Renaissance, they would have said, the ancient Romans, who were so successful, had a Senate, which was a small council of elite people. So we'll create a Senate like the ancient Romans, and we'll be one more step along the path to that kind of success that the Romans had in the past. So this discourse is very wide-ranging and has a broad range of uses. And it goes deep in society. it's harder to see it at the level, say, of everyday people. But everyday people are also talking. When you get everyday people talking in the kind of records where we can see it, for example, in Inquisition records at the end of the 16th century, you see them talking in the same terms. Going back to earlier first times. Our city was founded by the Romans. And that makes us special. That puts us in a special place. It means we should be loyal to our city. So it's like I say, it's 300 pages. It's a large part of this book, but it's a very powerful discourse, and it's used for basically for explaining and defending change, and also for that crucial question of where are we, who are we, those kinds of questions that every society has to answer in some ways, although often we don't actually articulate it, but we still ask it over and over again. And I think most of us don't think of ourselves as the aftermath of the ancient Roman world. Perhaps a few classics, if we have any classics professors in here. But George may think of himself that way, right, yeah, of ancient Greek society. Okay, I hope I've begun to answer that question. It's a good one, yeah.
In the artist, the philosopher, and the warrior, Machiavelli is presented as a really miserable, to put it in simple terms, man living in a chaotic society. That society that is described in the book is the one that gives you the impression of a corrupted one, and in addition to this, a society that disliked at that time the intellectual mind. And at the same time, though, it is this kind of thoughts of the intellectuals that were promoted and pushed by very few, but some people in Italy, particularly in Florence, which really reminds us of maybe not humanism, but very humanistic ideas. So that's really a paradox, isn't it? And a contradiction itself, to see both movements contradicting each other and trying to survive in that kind of very terrible environment Machiavelli lived in,
Right.
Florence.
Yes, since I wrote a book before on Machiavelli, I steal some stuff from Machiavelli in this book. And I see him as, I portray him as a tragic character, not, prescient, a figure who's anticipating modern political science or power politics, but actually as a fairly conservative person responding to a tremendous crisis that struck Italy after 1494, when it becomes the kind of battleground for all of Europe. And I only alluded to the term virtue. I didn't have enough time to talk about it, but that's a powerful key to his thought and why I see him as more conservative, because basically his vision of virtue is very similar to kind of 14th century ideal of an active civic life where people are willing to sacrifice themselves for their city and their society, and that and kind of reason, control that allow you to hopefully face up to those nasty French and Spanish and Germans who seem much more violent and passionate from an Italian perspective. It's kind of refreshing to see Italians as not passionate and violent, but anyhow, that's a good question. It's a really big issue. Yeah. I don't. Anne?
Well, thank you, Guido, for your talk. I would like for you perhaps to address the other word in your title, which is Italian.
Yes, somebody was going to ask that.
Because you're being, an expert on Venice, and you mentioned Florence, and I'm wondering if, in fact, the Renaissance didn't create Italy, and rather than Italy create the Renaissance, in the sense that we have a vision of, of a land that shares all the values that you were talking about, but when half of that peninsula was really, governed by another country.
Right.
Don't mention which.
Well, for a while it was governed by the Angevins from France until the Aragonese took it away, right?
Well, but so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the differences in these city-states and
Right.
how that creates the sense of this culture.
Actually, when I started writing this book, I was really kind of apologetic about talking about Italy at all, because there is a kind of school of thought that says, well, Italy didn't exist. And of course, it doesn't exist in the modern sense. But as I worked through the book, I was more and more struck by the way it did exist for people at this time. Even at the same time that a Venetian could hate somebody from Padua, and somebody from Milan would not speak to somebody from Torino or something like that. So there was strong what's called campanile. You had a strong identity with your own city. But at the same time, people like Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch, they all wrote in Italian because they wanted to reach a broader Italian audience. Now, the thing that's really strange is there was no Italian. So that makes it more complicated as well. But I think, and Machiavelli also, in the last part of the last chapter of The Prince, appeals to defend Italy against the barbarians. But that's not new. That's old. When Italians were, for example, the same Italian merchants who were fighting with each other in Italy for control of markets, when they were in the Levant or in Northern Europe, were often lumped together in Italian communities. So over and over, and then they're living in the ruins of an old civilization. Okay, so I think there was an Italianness, but I think you're right. It also grows across the period, and in fact, the whole problem of language helps to do that as people begin to pick out those early Florentine writers who weren't actually living in Florence and had very little to do with Florence on the whole, as the models for the language. Certainly it's a circular relationship. As far as the South is concerned, in the first iteration of the book, well, not the first, but one iteration of the book when it was only 1,300 pages in manuscript and was going out to readers, a really great reader who just died, John Marino, who, yes, at the University of UC San Diego, he clobbered me because I said, the south of Italy wasn't part of the first part of the Rinascimento. Basically, I divided it into two periods, about 1250 to 1450, which I call the first Rinascimento, which is more urban, Republican, even though republics lose out in that period. The second Rinascimento, which is more courtly and a kind of different, more aristocratic world. And so what I argued was in the first half, the South doesn't really fit. It's ruled by the Angevins. It's got a Gothic culture. They don't appeal to ancient world as the base of their culture and society. They appeal to Angevin precedents, medieval precedents, which still fits with my model in some way. But it really does seem a different world. And John was very upset about that, and I had to write it. It went from 1,300 to like 1,500 pages, writing in all the things that he was asking about. But I think the book's better for that. I cut lots out. It would have been a lot longer if I hadn't spent a lot of time cutting. So, but I stuck with my guns, and I said the South doesn't really work in the beginning, but in the second half, in the more aristocratic and courtly period, it does work, because Italy is moving back closer to the courtly world of Northern Europe, and it's being strongly influenced by Aragonese culture and society. As much as Italians don't want that to be the case, it is. So that's my second Renaissance. And then the Renaissance ends essentially when they amalgamate enough. It's more complicated, but when they fit in enough that they're not really that different from the rest of Europe, socially, politically, culturally, economically. And also when the new begins to ruin things. Because you can deny the new only so long, but there's a long chapter on how they try and make printing old, make the new world old, make all these things that are obviously new and upsetting the apple cart. They spend a lot, it's amazing to watch how they for example, take something like printing and make it old so that it isn't a threat.
I was wondering why you're embracing the word Rinascimento and rejecting the word Renaissance, which means the same thing. Is it just because they're, it's the lousy French that are coming in? Or
I think Renaissance has a lot of baggage that. Would you name? I don't know. Would you name 20th century U.S. history? I don't know. The Russian century or something like that. Russia had a big impact. It just seems to me like the wrong. I hate to do this to my French friends. Some of my best friends are French, but.
No, but seriously, I mean, there is the question of what. If you're going to go around, we're not going to go around saying Rinascimento, right? Because you're going to still be saying the Italian Renaissance.
My poor students are saying Rinascimento.
Yeah.
Those poor kids.
Okay.
And everybody in Italy says Rinascimento, although to be honest, they mean a slightly different period, which is another problem which I didn't think I would bring up.
Right.
But for Italians, the Rinascimento begins about 1500, and it's the beginning of the modern world, which is definitely not the way I'm thinking about it. The more I think about it, I really should have bit the bullet and stepped on Karl's toes and called it the real Reformation. But I don't think Cambridge would have published it at this point.
Many folks think about, when they think about Renaissance or Rinascimento, either one, think of painting.
Yeah.
And obviously I haven't read the book yet, but I wonder how you deal with painting, which is so prominent in general awareness of it, and how you deal with that in the themes of the book.
Yeah, I try and integrate it into, like gender, I try and not do it as a separate category, but integrate it into the general discussion, which is not easy to do because I'm not an art historian. And the couple art historians who read it said, not bad for somebody who's not an art historian. But I do have one chapter that's kind of dedicated to looking at art in a way, it would take a while to explain how it works. But in Machiavellian Love, I developed this idea of consensus realities. And I don't know if we even want to get into it. But consensus realities, one of the big questions is about how identity works in a society where people don't have really a strong inner sense of self. A lot of your sense of self is outward. And Stephen Greenblatt got into that with the idea of Renaissance self-fashioning. And this is a kind of spin-off of that, trying to deal with, I think, some of the weaknesses of Greenblatt's theory. And basically what consensus realities suggest is that people really think of themselves in a kind of negotiation with the groups around them in the small, intimate society of Rinascimento cities. So with your family, with your peers, with your guild members, with your confraternity, with your neighbors. And you have a slightly different identity. You can have actually significantly different identity with each of those people. And it's a constant ongoing negotiation. So for example, if I'm a 17-year-old boy, really anxious to prove my manhood, I may be going to prostitutes or worse and getting into all kinds of trouble. And with my peers, that makes me a man. With my family, obviously, they don't know about that because I want to negotiate a different identity with them, if possible. So people have kind of multiple social identities in this kind of vision. And in this chapter vaguely on art, what I use is I look at art to show how art is creating these consensus realities. It's a kind of attempt. It's attempt to create in the audience a sense of these kinds of things, especially for political figures. So I look at the Medici, how they present themselves and how they create a kind of consensus of reality about their personalities and their rule. Or also how artists, it's interesting to see how artists present themselves in their paintings. Some artists kind of put themselves in the back, and others like Botticelli, there's a, I can't remember exactly what the title of the painting is, but you've got Lorenzo de' Medici, the young one, kind of on one side of the framing, one side of the picture, with his sword, this long sword and his tight pants on, and you think, this is a masculine person who is going to dominate society. And on the other side, framing the picture, is Botticelli, is big, in his big, rich, golden robes, almost saying, I've made it. I'm as big as Lorenzo de' Medici, or at least trying to create that consensus reality. So I don't know how well that chapter works, but it was a fun chapter to write, and you may read it and say, but what?
It was a good answer. That's a start.
Oh, thanks.
You mentioned the urban landscape as an expression of the spirituality of the times, the neighborhoods, and so on. I was thinking that 15th century Florence, the construction of the early piazzi and by the wealthy nobles and so on, the purpose was more to set off the palazzo that they were constructing. So would you say that maybe a more dominant force or expression was one of symbolism of power, of expression of power of certain individuals, that they had this power and they could really transform the urban fabric to express their position?
That's a very good point. And I don't think it's one or the other. For example, one of the big expenses of many powerful families in Florence and in Venice and other cities was to buy and equip chapels in churches. And they would have their own chapel with their own great works of art, which were spiritual. And so they're playing both together. If you think about it, making yourself a dominant your family a dominant family in a neighborhood that's thought of, say, as the neighbor of San Polo or St. Paul, you are not just dominating it architecturally, you're also tying in with the spiritual aspect of the place. So you're obviously right, but I wouldn't leave it just there. I think it's too easy to see it as simple, straightforward, kind of modern power, and it's not. It's a more complex power in a world that's strongly spiritual as well as political and economic and things like that. One thing I didn't have time to talk about, which is fascinating, is the way, every single church has under the altar relics. It's empowered by the spiritual connection to an earlier first time. So you have these, we think of this, you go around these cities and you think, there's a church, let's go in, it's cool, because it's too hot walking around Italy. But, this is a trans-temporal, it's kind of like a connection across time. It's, like a time machine. You go in there and you're next to these powerful spiritual forces which are capable of making miracles happen, healing you, doing all kinds of things. St. Mark, when Venice is in trouble, they've lost St. Mark's body. St. Mark reaches out from the pillar where he's been lost, where his body has been lost. The hand reaches out and says, I'm going to save you. I'm going to lead you to victory in this war that we're having. So, power is deeply intertwined with the spiritual in this world. Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple times now the idea of Renaissance as Reformation, and I'm really intrigued by that idea, although I can't tell how serious you're being about that. Are you we've separated the Renaissance from the Reformation and sort of temporal paradigms, just as we've sort of drawn away from the Renaissance, many of us,
Yeah.
as a temporal paradigm. Are you suggesting that we consider again the Renaissance and Reformation in a sort of Ren-Graf way?
No. If we're going to go down that road, I think it takes a much more profound rethinking of what's going on. And Hughes would probably be uncomfortable because they'd also go back into the Middle Ages. I was very influenced by a professor of mine a long, long time ago, Gerhard Ladner, who started out writing about the idea of reform in the early medieval church and kept going later and later. And when I studied with him, he was already doing what I thought of as the Italian Renaissance. And if he'd lived, I think he would probably have the idea of reform going up through the 19th century. So there's a danger, but I don't know. If you want to tackle it, I think it'd be an interesting idea. The danger of it is that I think Italy is a driving force in reform from about 1250, and then late 15th century it becomes more. Well, I don't even. No, let's not even get started with that.
One more. Dominique.
Hey, you're fun. So, what could another title be? A conservative revolution or taming the conservatives? Is this a posture to make people, just deal with a little change, or is it actually this wealth and the wealth of ideas and creativity is coming from the anxiety? It seems like you're jumping.
I see the connection you're trying to make, but unfortunately, I think it's a modern connection.
No,
Yeah, and I don't think we can think of going back in that way in the Renaissance or the pre-modern world or in most non-modern societies. I think it hangs much more on an idea of circular time. And I have real hokey examples for my students. I talk about you buy a Ford, and you think it's just as good as a Ferrari. It's a great machine. It works. But then as time goes by, it keeps getting worse, and it begins to fall apart. And sorry about anybody who has a Ford, but. Yeah, and that's another way of looking at time. That time, with time, all things break down, things fall apart, and what needs to be done to overcome that situation in circular time is to go back to the beginning, you need to get your Ford fixed up as good as new, renewed, reformed. Okay? So it's not so much a conservative way of thinking as a circular way of thinking about time that was dominant still in the Renaissance. Interestingly, when you look at 14th century documents, you think they would be from the date of birth of Christ. It's a Christian society, right? But usually they're by indictions, 15-year cycles. And only around mid-century do they begin to give indictions and from the birth of Christ. So this circular thinking is very, very powerful. And as I was suggesting, if you think about it, first clocks are actually models of the universe. And the circular gearing is the circular movement of time. The repetition of time and the universe overlap. And this goes all the way through society. It's a deep way of understanding things. So, going back to first times is a powerful thing. And there are moments when it's brilliant. I talk about Marsilio Ficino. For me, it's fascinating the way he discovers that first times really fit perfectly with the magical world of the everyday people around him. This kind of, it must have been one of this oh wow moments, when everything seemed to come together and make sense. Unfortunately, it was based on forged texts that weren't really from first times. But that's the way it usually works. Still, it must have been a fantastic moment when he discovered how these things went together and made sense of everything. It's kind of like the combined general theory of physics that's going around today. I wonder what people will think of that in 500 years. Sorry, George.
Thank you, Dr. Ruggiero. All right, folks, so before we wrap this up, I have a couple of announcements to make. One, reminder for our internet audience, there's still time to call the number on your screen, buy a copy of the book. We'll get it signed and shipped to you anywhere in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, so many of you came out tonight that if, when you got up, you folded your chair and stacked it against the wall, that would be a big help for us to clear out this room for the signing line. I want to thank Professor Miyoko Suzuki. I want to thank our introducer this evening, Professor Mary Lindemann. And please give a big hand for Professor Ruggiero. Thank you very much. Thank you.